So with OpenLDAP, like I said, VAST will use OpenLDAP for users and groups, group POSIX attribute lookup. So we're looking for UID numbers and GID numbers and the group membership options for those. This is something that we're not going to, you don't necessarily need to have. If you're using NIS, you're using something that has RFC 2307 attributes in there. So if your Active Directory environment already has these attributes in there, we don't need a separate OpenLDAP provider. But we can use this in combination with AD or in supplemental support for AD to get those. So if you're in the process of migrating users over, you've got some users that have attributes in Active Directory and others that don't, we can utilize a combination of both of those to put them together. And we'll also go through and we'll use OpenLDAP to consult netgroup information. So if you're not familiar with what a netgroup is, basically a netgroup is a defined list of computers that is stored as an object with an LDAP, so that when we go through and we define our host access rules or our host-based access rules, such as which clients are allowed to do read-write, which clients are allowed to use read-only, we can reference a netgroup rather than having to put in the individual computers or the individual client IP addresses or host names in those host-based access options. So we can make use of all those there. So let's talk about how we go through and how we set these up. So within VAST, very easy to go through and set up. You'll go into the GUI within VAST, go into user management, go into LDAP, and say create a new LDAP, and you'll be presented with a menu to go through and set these up. We'll talk about what each one of these fields are. So the first one is that, hey, we need to go through and provide a URL or a listing. We need to tell the VAST cluster where the LDAP servers are that we're going to use. And we're going to use two different prefixes for this. We're going to use LDAP : / if we're going to be going through and utilizing this LDAP server to query it either as unencrypted or using TLS. If we're going to be doing something like LDAP-S, which is a little different connection protocol, TLS connection means that you go through, you connect up unencrypted and say, do a start TTLS transaction, and that will, everything from there will be encrypted. The LDAP-S starts the initial connection encrypted for that. They're both considered secure. VAST does support both of those. The main difference here is that LDAP runs on port 329, LDAP-S uses port 636. For that. But we can specify one or the other for these. We can put multiple LDAP servers in this listing here if we do have multiple redundant LDAP servers there. So we'll provide the URL for that particular connection or those connections that we wish to use. We'll define which port we wish to go through and use, and then we'll go through and also define a domain name that we wish to use for this. Now, LDAP in itself does not necessarily require a domain name. It's typically not used. But if you're using NFSv4 and you want to set that NFSv4 domain name, this is what the NFSv4 domain name would be used for if you're using LDAP here in this case here. So we'll select that. Then we also need to provide a bind DN. So we're going to assume that you're going to have to provide some authentication, or your LDAP server is expecting some authentication. So we're going to ask for that here. There is an option under advanced to go through and change this so that you don't necessarily provide a bind DN if you're going to do anonymous authentication. But the default setup, the most common one, is it's going to ask for this here for this. So you provide your bind DN. This is going to be in your DN syntax, so CN with a name, and then so on and so forth, and then your bind password or the user's password for this. The user doesn't have to be anything specific, no super user rights or anything like that. This typically would just be something that's a read-only user that has access and can bind to LDAP and do the lookups necessary to do things. And then the one thing that I forgot to mention here too is we'll need to specify a base DN. So the base DN tells us within LDAP where are we going to go through and look for doing the searches for the queries for users. So the base DN is going to typically be the default of just the top of the list. But if you have your users and your groups in a certain area and you don't want to spend time doing the searches across your entirety of your environment, you can go through and specify to kind of restrict where we're going to go through and look up and where we're going to do those searches from. So you specify that bind DN here, or that base DN there. And then with this here, we can go through and we need to talk about attribute mapping. So what attribute mapping is, it basically tells the cluster when I'm looking for these types of values that I'm searching, so things like where do I find the GID number of a user? Where do I find the UID number? What is the format of the group, the group entry or the group object look like, and what does it contain? We can go through and we specify that here. So the default mappings are generally going to be correct for most of the instances that are out there, especially if you're doing things with LDAP or with OpenLDAP. But you can go through and modify things. Maybe you're not specifying the UID number attribute for user objects to contain what their UID number is. Maybe you're using some other attribute like employee ID or something like that. You can specify and change these as you wish to go through and do that. So by default, let's say use the default. If you want to customize those, you can customize these. And if you're not sure, you can always come back and edit the connection and modify things as you need to after the fact. And we'll talk about in a bit how we go through and validate things once the connections have been made. So this kind of goes through again, talks about the basic LDAP fields and what their values are for this. This is outlined in the vast documentation for this, but I'm just going to kind of point out a few differences here between what you might see for the LDAP fields for OpenLDAP versus what we'd see for Active Directory here. Just some differences here with these here. So primary one here is that, what is the object class that we're using? Most cases for Active Directory, there's an object class which defines what kind of object is there. It's going to be a user object. Otherwise, with OpenLDAP, it's going to be a POSIX account. Same thing with the group or POSIX group, depending on which one you're using. But these are all, again, going to be very straightforward for these. Normally, the key ones we're looking for are going to be just make sure, hey, what is the attribute we're looking for GID number? What is the attribute we're looking for to give us a UID number? And then, maybe how is the member UID or are the groups defined for them? So that's kind of the fields there. We'll also want to go through and we'll want to define the encryption method that we wish to use. So the encryption method, this is going to be how do we encrypt the connection, the LDAP connection from the VAST cluster to the OpenLDAP server. By default, this is set to none. This is the most compatible one. Unfortunately, it's not always the most secure. So I don't expect that a lot of you will go through and be using none as the encryption method. So you'll be using something either specifying start LDAP-S for the URL in the beginning, or you're going to go through and specify use encryption here of start TLS here for this, which will encrypt that connection there. If you need to go through, you need to specify a custom certificate to use for doing that connection or to validate that the LDAP server you're communicating to is the one that you're expecting. We can go through and accept TLS certificates here. So you can upload those TLS certificates as part of the initial configuration or modify them after the fact. So there are a couple other options here for this. Specifically, we'll talk about the authentication method that's used. So remember how I talked initially about specifying a bind DN, which is the user that is going to connect up, is going to be used to connect up to OpenLDAP. This will allow us to go through and change that. If you want to use an anonymous bind for that, we can use an anonymous bind for this. We can also use SASL binding for this as well. SASL changes some of the connection types there. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on explaining that here, but we can use SASL binding if we want for that. So you can select those here. And then another one here, and this is really more for if things don't work out initially, you may have to change things, is to talk about the group query mode. The group query mode is going to go through, and this is going to tell us how we're expecting the user objects and the group objects to be represented, how they're going to be defined. Specifically, are we using an RFC 2307 format, which means that the group object is the only thing that contains the user. So if you think about how traditional Linux and Unix do things, where you have your etc password file, which just contains the user and their primary group, and then the etc groups has the group name and then the users that are part of that group. But the etc password file doesn't contain any additional groups, just that primary one. So we've got that option here. We can search based on that. We can search based on the RFC 2307 BIS, which is going to be a variation of that, where it says that, the user object actually will have entries in there saying, oh, hey, they are a member of this group and this group and this group and this group for that. Or we can use a compatible lookup where we'll actually do both of those to get all the group membership for that. Normally I recommend, and this is the default, I'm leaving it set to compatible, but if you find that maybe there's some performance implications or performance issues with lookup, or we're not finding things properly, we can change those there. There is also an option here to go through and specify a group-based DN. This would be in a case where maybe your groups for your that are defined, the group objects are in a separate location than what the base DN is. So you specified that, hey, all of your users are going to be in the users OU, and all your groups are going to be in the group OU. You got two different ways to either specify your base DN to be at the high level that covers both of them, or you could specify your group-based DN would be at the groups OU, and the base DN for users would be at the users OU. So we can control some of those. And there's some other options here talking about a DNS operation mode. This tells us how we go through and how and when the cluster does lookups of net groups and how it caches that information for them. And the final one here is a VMS authentication provider. And this VMS authentication provider is, this goes through, and we'll see this for OpenLDAP, we'll also see this for Active Directory. This will indicate that this LDAP connection will be used to query VMS users, so that when I log into VMS, or if I want to log into VMS, my username and password will be queried against this provider, rather than relying on local users. So this is how you'd integrate into AD or OpenLDAP for VMS access. And we'll talk about that more as we go forward here.